Um, Hello, I want to welcome you to the Remote Strong webinar series tonight. Well, actually, I should say for me, I'm on the East Coast. So for some of you who are just in your afternoon, today we're going to be doing strengthening your team with workflows. We're going to have questions and answers at the end. So please use your Q&A button at the bottom, and if a question comes up or you have a comment or whatever, please use the chat box, but you can use those throughout the presentation, and then at the end we'll go over those. So without further ado, I want to introduce Laura Renner, who is the founder of Freedom Makers, and Sarah Skaronsky, who's the principal consultant at EOS HR Consulting. And ladies, I'm looking forward to this content because this is one of my favorite workflows. It's what I work on with my clients. So there you go.
All right.
All right. So a little bit about me. I am a veteran of the Air Force. I'm actually in the reserves as well. So I'm here. You can probably tell it's obvious I'm in a hotel. I'm on duty with the reserves right now. But I founded Freedom Makers because I noticed that we had a lot of small businesses who needed help, but they didn't need like full-time or even part-time help. And at the same time, through my affiliation with the Air Force, I knew how military spouses struggle to find careers or to make careers because they're constantly moving. And so I thought, let's put the two together, and that's where Freedom Makers was born. And we've been doing it now for 5 years. And what we find is with a lot of clients, for them to be successful with growing their business, with delegating, through delegating work, they really need to have good workflows in place. And so since we've been doing it for 5 years, since we've been helping our clients for 5 years, that's part of what led to Sarah and I partnering up to present this series so that we can share what we've learned through running our own businesses as well as helping our clients.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Skaronsky with EOS HR, and we work with small businesses who are in need of HR services because anytime you have an employee, there's some sort of HR issue that comes up. And so we focus mainly with small companies, and in doing that, we've had, because most of that is remote, we've had to create workflows and help our clients create workflows for onboarding and offboarding of their employees, and making sure that all those processes, all those tick marks are checked so that everything is taken care of properly. So we're excited you're here and excited for this topic because there's a lot of juicy tidbits to learn.
If you've been with us, you've been through a few of these topics. If you're new to us, these are all the topics we've presented on so far, and they're on each of our YouTube channels. So we should probably add those channels to this slide for our next one. But we've discussed, how to have a strong battle rhythm, how to build a culture of trust, how to keep it legal, how to define the lanes of authority, lanes of responsibility, and levels of authority. And last time we talked about empowering your team for decisions. So today we're going to talk about workflows. We've got 2 more after this that we're going to share with you guys. And so, like I said, the previous ones you can view on each of our YouTube channels, and then we'll add the rest as well. But also, they all tie together. So you'll hear us today kind of referencing back to other ones. And so that's part of why we have this graphic here, is that we tie them all together. They all build on each other or tear each other down. So when each one is strong, you're building on each other. So that's what we're trying to demonstrate here. All right, so let's get down to business. When it comes to building workflows, what I like to say is there's 3 components to it, and we're going to talk about each of them today. And those are triggers, tools, and actions. And we'll go through each of them and kind of give you some ideas for how to strengthen your workflows so that your team can really just interact without the fog and friction, and they can just move on or move in sync with each other and have it all flow smoothly. I feel like even though we've been saying it, it's like I'm dropping, like, what's the word, like name dropping kind of thing. I'm like, so they'll stay in their lanes of responsibility and they'll trust each other, and they'll have
keep referencing back. This episode, you'll really see a lot more of the building on the other episodes. This is where everything really starts to connect together. as we pull in these workflows, because now we're using all of those tools that we've been talking about for the past couple months and the past several episodes. So this is, and it really is those levels of authority, those lanes of responsibility. You're going to hear it a lot because it's really, we're really driving it home with the workflows now.
Exactly. All right, so we'll jump right into triggers. And this, to me, this is the most important part. And if you get nothing out of today, focus on those triggers. Like, that is the critical piece, in my opinion, in my mind. Because the thing is if you have a business and you're running it, whether you have 0 people on your team, whether you're doing it yourself, or you have teams of teams, a team of teams, the thing is you already have a workflow. And whether that's written down or it's all in your head, or it's like, seems like you're flying by the seat of your pants every time, it's still relatively there, and it's a workflow. So when you want to strengthen your workflows, you got to start with your triggers. Like, look at your gaps and figure out what that trigger is, or what the trigger is not, and therefore focus on creating a trigger that works. And what I mean by that is the trigger prevents the gap, or it bridges the gap, right? I use my hands a lot. And so, yeah, so we'll talk about that more in a second too, but I wanted to give a shout out to this book that's come out. It's called Upstream, and it's written by Dan Heath. And I don't know him at all. This is not like a paid plug or anything. This is just straight up, I love what he writes. And I haven't read this book yet, but that link there is to an article that he wrote regarding the concept of going upstream. And I included the QR code as well. So if you're looking at the screen right now, just point your phone camera at that, and it'll pull up that article to highlight what going upstream means. Basically, the concept is prevention. What do you do to prevent the gap that happens? And in that article, he specifically talks about an example of newborn babies. They put an ankle bracelet on them to help with abduction, reduce abduction. And in this one hospital, they kept falling off. And so then that's the idea, is we're usually just going, that we don't stop to say, how do we prevent that from happening? And rather it's, oh, a tag's missing, we got to go find it. And so I encourage you to check out that article. But that's kind of the idea, is addressing the gap by preventing it from happening or finding a way to go over it.
Right. And so going back to a little bit more about the triggers, is, you know, we're talking about what that gap is, and when you look at real life examples of that, Laura, what are some things in your company that you saw were triggers that you had to address, or you had to create the workflows around?
We didn't talk about this in our practice session.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And we did because we talked about and for us, it's really about things like the I-9, you know, different simple forms that we have to do, that we have to use on a daily basis in HR. And being able to focus on those as a trigger, and also knowing that sometimes you need to delve deeper. So, you know, for us, we found a gap where, you know, every employee needs to sign an I-9 form. And not only do every employee need to sign it, but the employer or an employer representative needs to sign it.
Within like 3 days, right?
Within 3 days. Yeah, there is a time frame on that. And one of the things that we were bumping up against with one of our clients is, and this is more prevalent now with COVID and with everybody working remotely, but at the time, one of our clients, 90% of their employees that they brought on were working remotely. They were out in the field, and we needed to know that, so that we could make arrangements, because in California there's special rules, because California likes to be special when it comes to employment laws, and there's special rules about who can actually sign on behalf of the employer. And but we weren't finding out that these were remote employees until the day the person started, and then all of a sudden we were scrambling, trying to figure out who can go, you know, where are they? Is it someplace that we could go to? Is it someplace that somebody else could go to? And so we had to take a step back and look at, okay, there is an issue here. And that gap was, is this person remote or not? And so for us, we start our workflow with a status change form, and I'll go more into that later on in the presentation. But we start that with the workflow with a status change form, and by adding a simple check mark that says remote employee, we were able to resolve this issue, because now in the workflow, if that check mark is set, when we're going through our onboarding process, we know that we need to create how we're going to do the I-9 for that employee. Now things have changed with COVID, but yeah, it's at the time somebody needed to physically be out there to do that, and now we could do it simply by adding a check mark. So the other thing is that we're not talking about necessarily technology.
Oh wait, well, hang on, if you don't mind, we can go back.
Yep.
There are types of triggers, right? So triggers can be like time. So for example, paying your company bills, right? So I pay them on the 10th and 25th of every month. So I'll be paying ours tonight, right? So they can be time, or it can be, you're going to check this inbox every day at noon, or this voicemail box every day when you come in the morning, or however. So you can have it set by time, or you can have it set by an action. So in Sarah's example of when that check mark, when that box was checked, then that triggered them into action. And so that's what I mean, where it can be either like time, or it can be something happening with us. When a new client wants to start, we have them fill out a form, and that form triggers us to launch our project in our project management software, Asana, which we talk about all the time, but that helps us, that triggers us into action. So there's just two ways to consider that. Is it time-based, or is it action-based? And then taking that example further, let's say Sarah added that checkbox, and yet you were overlooking it and not noticing that, hey, that was checked and we didn't do anything about it. That's an example of a gap where, okay, that trigger is not working. Let's figure out a way to make sure we notice that check mark to ensure that we handle that process in time to be compliant with I-9.
Right.
Which then is a good segue into, well, why not just use technology?
Right, and technology is great, and we love technology. I love technology. I love the greatest gadget, but it's not always. It doesn't always help if all you really need is a check mark on a checklist. And so making sure that you can do something and you know how to do it in a simple fashion is much more effective, because then you can build into a tech tool.
Exactly. And as anyone who's viewed these or attended these before, you probably have heard me say it a million times, right? Tech amplifies. So if you already have garbage workflow, tech is just going to make it more garbage. If you have a great workflow, tech is going to make it more great, right? Or greater. And so that's the thing, is you want to really avoid thinking, okay, the technology will solve it. Because I've also seen that happen where people buy a software that really is above their level, not necessarily of comprehension, but rather of what they need. So then it's overly complicated, it's overwhelming, and they end up just not using it. I mean, I was guilty of that. Sarah, I think you've gone through that too, and we've seen clients go through that, because it's the nice, shiny, beacon on the hill that everyone has and everyone raves about, and then really it's not what you need in that moment. And so if you have your workflow in place, then it's easier to find technology that will fit that more closely than just the hottest, latest thing. And at the same time, if you are using technology already for your workflows, I've seen the gaps can be getting two technologies to talk to each other. And sometimes you can solve that with other tech tools. Other times that's where you need to have some sort of human trigger in place, right? So like, let's say, with Sarah's example of the checkbox, let's say, that checkbox then was supposed to trigger getting the form ready, but you still need someone to go launch the form, right? And maybe there would be a technology tool that would do that automatically, but if not, you still need someone to go do that. And that's where you want to look at, okay, is the right person doing it? And if not, can I move it up earlier in the stream?
Right. And the other thing to be careful with tech tools is that there's a implementation and learning curve to those as well. So if you are super busy and you just need to make sure that all the steps are getting done, at that moment is not the time to implement a any type of complicated tech tool. Now, if you can do one that's simple, where you're just creating a checklist, an online checklist, and then you can build on that, which is one of the nice things about like Asana as a tool and some other tools. You can take that entry level basic checklist and put it into a tool like Asana, and then start to add on some of the other features that Asana has, or some of the other features that you can integrate with as you get more time, because you now have this process in place, this workflow in place. Then you can invest in that. But if you have to spend 20 hours of time just to get it up and running, now you're even farther behind and you're even under more stress. And I've had this, I speak from personal experience, that something looks bright and shiny out of the box, and all of a sudden it's 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm still trying to figure out how to make it work. And I go to bed defeated and feeling like I've just wasted a lot of money and time.
Mm-hmm.
So just be careful on how you choose to implement those tools.
Right. And to go, even though we're like, just avoid technology, or, we're not saying that, but, just be careful about what,
not at all. We love technology.
Right. Be careful about what rabbit holes you go down. Right. And so here's a rabbit hole for you. But that's why I generally prefer freemium models over free trial models, because then you can start small. You can figure out, does this work for you? And then as you grow, you can upgrade to the model to the level that you need in that moment, right? It grows with you, if you will. The free trials I don't like, because then you spend all that time uploading it, and then 2 weeks, a month later, you're like, yeah, this isn't what I want. And so that's generally why I prefer freemium over free trial. And we have a blog every year where we recommend the tech tools, and we almost always include the freemium. I think this year we broke our rule, but it was an asterisk. We're like, here's a bonus one that we just love, but they don't have a freemium model. And so, so just generally though, I prefer freemium models because of that, because you can figure it out if it works for you, and then upgrade as you grow.
Right.
All right, so you're starting to work on triggers, and now the next step, the next component is tools. And what I mean by tools are things like access, so login information. If you're going to create a login for someone else, or if you're going to share your login, then making sure that whoever is completing the workflow has the access they need, including templates. So that might be like Sarah, you're going to talk about here in a minute, having the I-9 sample, right? Having that template there, but also template emails or any kind of template contract, like really anything that you might having a workflow use. And then including scripts with that. So whether with that being on the phone, you want to have those in place so that whoever is doing it has everything they need to be able to do it from a tool perspective, and not tool like a toolbox, but tools like access and all the templates, the scripts, the instructions is next, but things like that. And so, yeah, do you want to talk more about the sample I-9?
Yeah, so with the going back to the example of the remote I-9, generally when you have somebody who's out remote, they would go to a notary public to get that signed in most states, not in California, but in most states. And one thing we find, even though everything online, everything from the immigration, everything that governs this says that a notary can do this, you put that form in front of a notary and they act like they've never seen it before, and they don't know what to do with it, and they don't know how it works. And so what we've ended up doing is creating a form, a template form that is sent to the employee that says, here's what you need to do. Here are the instructions that you need to do. And then here is a page that you can give to the notary. so that the notary knows exactly where they need to sign, that they don't have to notarize it, they're just acknowledging it, they're just checking your ID, all of those steps, but those are outlined in that template, in that script that can be given to the employee, and then the employee can pass that on to whoever's verifying their identification. So it's just important to make sure that it's standard, one, so that the information is out and it's understandable, but also so that you're not recreating it. So every time you have a remote I-9 or remote or whatever the workflow is, that you're like, oh wait, what was I supposed to tell them, and which steps did I have to do? And it's like you just create it once, and then you continue to use it, and you might build on it, you might fix it, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's there so that when it's 4:45 on a Friday and you know this needs to go out before 5 o'clock, you are not recreating the wheel. You have something, you can send it out, and you have that clarity of mind to be able to say, okay, that's done, I can check it off the list.
That's a great example, or we can take that example further in that when, say, they on the status change form, they click remote employee. So now your team knows, okay, we need to set this up for a remote I-9. And then they go to like a folder where all that is set, right? So they know, okay, step one, get that information go to this folder to copy that, to attach that sample to email to the employee, right? And then maybe you have a shared, not shared, saved template email that you send to the employee. And I remember in Outlook, you can even have the attachments already in there. You just have this template, right?
Right.
So then they just got to go in, type the employee's name in an email and hit send, right? But I know we don't have like a raised hand situation here, but at least you and me, how many of us are guilty of just going to the last email we sent and copying and pasting, right? And we think that doesn't take up much time, but it does. And there's where that you forget to change a name, so it's inaccurate. Maybe you don't remember the last one and you made a change on the last one, so you went to the one before and it doesn't have that change in there. And it takes up that mental RAM that you're wasting trying to say, oh, who's that last employee I sent it to? Let me go find it. So when that's an example of access and tools where everything is saved in that folder and the right person has access to that folder and it's there with the instructions or whatnot, rather than relying on, let me go find my last email that I used for that.
Exactly. And another example in the HR realm that just recently came up is in California, we're required to give out certain pamphlets at the beginning of employment, and the California EDD and the DOL and all these, they will go in and they'll make a change, and I don't even know it. Like, you could probably compare them side by side, and they don't look different, except maybe the font is a little different or something. But they make these changes, and we always have to make sure we're giving them the most accurate, the most current and accurate one, and making sure that we're using that takes time. And so one of our triggers that we just put in this week was with our generalist. I asked her to once a month go in and check for any updates so that we have access to that, because what I was finding was I was going out, anytime I was sending it, I was going out to the EDD site and pulling the most recent one down because I didn't trust that we had the most recent one. And that is more time, more mental RAM, all of that. And now we have within our own workflow to make sure that we're keeping up on that. So when we're talking workflows, we're talking things that could happen once a year or once a month, and things that happen on a daily basis.
Exactly. And that's why we keep saying triggers, because it's like, okay, I want this to be faster or easier. How do I do it? Just think about what's the trigger, right? So in your case, it's like, well, let's just go once a month rather than go every time, right?
Right, exactly.
You change trigger from a new hire to once a month.
Yeah.
All right. And then the third component of a workflow is actions, right? So that's kind of the give me. I think that's what everyone just automatically thinks of. Like, what are my steps that I do or that need to be accomplished? And so that's why we leave that one for last, because the first two are ones that I think are often overlooked. especially the triggers one, right? But then also it's like, oh, I can't tell you how many clients start with us and they're like, oh yeah, I need to give you an email address. And it's like, you could have done that before. I mean, not, it doesn't, it doesn't frustrate us, but I just, things that like that I noticed that they don't think about, oh, I need to give them access to these accounts in order for them to do what I want them to do, until they ask them to do what they want them to do. Right. And so then if you're the owner and you're in that situation, are you willing to stop what you're doing to give them access? But if you're thinking about it while you're improving your workflow, strengthening your workflow, then it's on your mind and you can take care of it then. So that's why we put tools in front of actions as well.
Right, right. And those checklists, these are things, I mentioned before that you can expand on these. So, any kind of flow chart or checklist or SOP, they shouldn't be a one and done. This is something that as you're going through it, when you create it, then you need to test it. And once you test it, it's important to say, oh, wait, I missed a step, or this didn't get done. Why didn't this get done? Oh, it wasn't in the checklist. So we need to go back and make sure that's in there, because they shouldn't be a stagnant thing, but they should have all of the details you need. Mm-hmm. And so when you're talking about checklists and going back to having the tools and having all that information, the SOPs, all of that should have the details so that somebody doesn't have to guess what your shorthand of an item is, because sometimes I go back to a checklist that I typed up quickly and I'm like, what did I mean by that? And so it's really important to make sure that there's a description of why are you doing this? Where do you find this information? How does it, like, what logins do you need? All of that is within that SOP or within that checklist instructions, so that you can follow through on the actions and not be stopped at every step going, okay, where was that login? Where do I find that? How do I do this step? It's all right there within the workflow.
Right. And you may notice we included 3 options here. And the reason why is because it's really whatever you prefer and how you operate. Like me personally, I love checklists. I think a lot of us do. We love just checking things off as we complete them and then seeing our progress, right? Another option is flowcharts, and flowcharts are particularly useful if you have multiple people responsible for something, in that you can do what's called a swim lane flowchart, right? Lanes of responsibility. So for example, hiring a new person, it might start with you guys being the HR people, but then it moves to the hiring manager. Like there's a step that, the resume reviews goes to the hiring manager and the interview goes to the hiring manager. Then it might need to be approved by the CEO or whatnot. Then it goes back to HR to handle the offer and all of that, right? So you have this flow chart that's going through these different lanes as it works its way through. That said, visually, I like looking at them. Honestly, I don't understand flowcharts, like all the different shapes and whatnot. So when they're like, build your flowchart, I'm like, no, I'm just going to go with my nifty difty checklist. And so, and then some people prefer to write out. And so that's where an SOP would come in, where they write everything out, which is great too. So it doesn't have to be any certain way. It's whatever works for you. And one option we did not include in here, but that I know Sarah and I both love, again, it's a technology, but it's called Loom, Loom, and it basically lets you screen record what you do. And so if you don't want to sit there and write out everything you do, the next time you're doing it, just hit Loom and hit record, and then you can send it to someone who can then codify it for you. And so recently we turned over, I let go of payroll. Finally, that was like a big milestone for me. It was like one of the last things I'm like, oh, I can't let it go. But I let it go, and I just hit Loom, went through my whole process, which that day I think took about an hour and a half or 2 hours, sent it to Erin, and she built an Asana project out of it, so that she can now do it, and she has all the steps that she needs to follow based on that Loom. So that's also an idea for capturing how you do it so that someone else can watch it and replicate it.
Right, and using a tool like Loom is really good, because when you're creating it yourself, sometimes you miss those steps. You miss over a section because you just know to do it. It's just ingrained in your memory. that
Yeah.
you do this. And I found this as I was creating SOPs, and I think I even mentioned this on one of our previous episodes, that I have my nephew is now currently helping with doing the marketing for this. But I knew what I did and I documented it all, but all of a sudden there was something that wasn't done. And when I went back to the checklist, it wasn't even on the checklist. So it wasn't that he didn't do it because he just skipped it. It was that I didn't even tell him to do it. And that was, part of my own muscle memory. I knew it had to be done, but I didn't get it documented. So having something like Loom where you are actually physically doing it and then having somebody else come in and document that for you can be very helpful to make sure that all of the steps are captured.
We didn't talk about this and we didn't necessarily include it in our content, but it also, in the past, we had talked about building a culture of trust and that being around communication. And I think when you have, just hearing your story with you and your nephew, like when you have something documented, then it also creates that transparency and to be able to communicate and be like, hey, you told me I need to do this. I don't have access to that. Can you share your login, or can you create an account for me so that I can go in and do that? And so then it's okay, rather than being like, well, I don't know how to do it, or you didn't tell me to do it, so I didn't do it. Now you can be like, oh yeah, I didn't tell you to do it because it's not on the list. And so it helps foster that culture of trust, because you're able to openly and transparently communicate what's missing and what's needed in order to better complete the checklist.
Right, and without any blame or any friction between the people. It's just it wasn't there, it wasn't done. So
Right.
it just needs to be fixed going forward. It's not a
Right.
Not a disciplinary issue at all. So.
Right. Like, I'm sure you've seen this a lot with managers. Like, I told them to do it. I don't know why they don't do it, when maybe they didn't tell them, because muscle memory for them. Right.
Right. Or how they told them wasn't what was heard.
Exactly.
I've had far too many who said they told them, and the person's like, that's not what they said. So, which is why HR likes things documented.
Yeah. All right, so we've gone through the three tools, or three components of building a strong workflow. And so now we want to spend the rest of this time kind of outlining other things to make it even stronger, right? And so, as you've heard us allude to already, having the lanes of responsibility, which was a previous episode, really, when those are clear, then it also kind of makes it easier to designate who's doing what in the workflow. When you know, okay, this person's lane is taking care of X, Y, and Z. Oh, the X, Y, and Z are steps 3 through 6 on my workflow. They need to be the ones doing it, and then they're going to hand it off to whoever is going to take care of steps 7 through 10, and they're going to receive it from whoever took care of steps 1 and 2, right? And so the lanes of responsibility feed into that strengthened workflow, because you're able to really designate who's doing what in the workflow.
Right, and it just makes it much easier for people to move through the workflow, so that there is not confusion, and there is not somebody feeling like they're burdened with everything. It becomes a true team atmosphere and a true team project.
Right. And I was joking when we practiced about adding yet another analogy, but it helps if you think of like the track runners when they're passing the baton, right? So if one lane knows they're responsible for steps 3 through 6, they know they need to hand it off at step 7, and they need to hand it off so that the baton doesn't get dropped. And the person responsible for step 7 knows they need to be there to pick it up, right? And so, and when you have so that as we were talking about, that culture of trust, that clarity, and then a strong workflow, then that helps, right? At the same time, that's where gaps might exist, and that's where you'll want to review triggers. Does person responsible for step 7 is the baton being passed off correctly? And is there something the person doing step 6 can do better to pass it off? I know that's kind of vague. An example, one of our sort of regular attendees, if it's okay for me to share, there was an issue where they would make an appointment and then launch a ticket. And so we were thinking, what if the appointment maker launched the ticket? and that helped reduce that gap there. So that's an example of a handoff that maybe wasn't happening, but at the same time, it didn't necessarily need, like, it wasn't anyone's fault, right? Like, truly step 7 could launch the ticket, and it just wasn't happening. So we thought maybe let's try step 6, being the one launching the ticket.
Right. And again, it goes back to looking at the gap, right? And figuring out what that is. So.
All right. And so, of course, we're always talking about remote teams, but of course, both of these work for, or this works for both in-person and remote teams. However, I think with in-person teams, it's a little bit easier to make sure the baton doesn't get dropped. At the same time, that makes it a little more frenetic. So therefore, you want to make sure that that works smoothly as well. But there are things that you want to, that are unique to remote teams that you want to make sure you're considering. And that is the idea that I like to call batching. So does it make sense to do it throughout the day, or can you just do them all at once, right? Email is a great example. If you keep your email open all day, or the notifications coming through, you're getting distracted by every little thing that comes through. Would it make sense to just check your email when you first start, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, and before you leave? And therefore you can just focus on that and get it knocked out, right? So same thing with different workflows. Do you need to be launching and working through each workflow all throughout the day, or can you do them in batches? And this is especially important if your remote teams are not on a structured time. Like if they're not working 8 to 12 every day, or 1 to 5, or maybe they're working Mondays and Wednesdays and have the other days off. Like if that's not happening, if it's more like work when you can type thing, which is how we work, then you want to make sure the workflows are not necessarily time-based, right? So rather than being every day at noon, maybe it's once a day or something like that. So you want to just keep that in mind of how you're structuring your remote teams as far as when they work, and making sure the workflows match that.
Right. All right. And I've mentioned a couple times about reviewing your workflows and making sure that these are not set in stone and they're not stagnant. And especially when you're bringing new people on, or when you're training new people, that you review what those workflows are and make sure that they're still relevant, and all the steps are still relevant. Right now with our clients, we're working with some clients who are in the process of implementing new systems. We still need a workflow for the current system, but when that new system comes in, we need to make sure that we've updated that process and that workflow, so that we're not missing steps, or we're not doing redundant work because it's now being done within an HRIS or within a payroll system. So, having regular workflows. We've also added, so for each of our clients, we use Asana, and we do onboarding and offboarding, and any kind of process that we do for an employee, we create a checklist for that for each client, because each client is a little bit different. And when you're dealing with multiple clients, you have to know, what's different about each of those clients. And so now our generalist, when she's creating and updating that checklist, she's putting in the notes the last time it was updated and reviewed, so that we can go through regularly and say, okay, has there been any changes with this client in the last month since this was looked at, and what do we need to do an update for?
So that's a great example of where a gap might happen. Like, yes, you're recording when it was last done. Do you have a trigger for when you'll do it next? And if not, right, then you'll want to create that trigger, right, to prevent that gap, if you will.
Right.
And so, so that's why regular review is a critical piece of this, exactly like you said. Or how many of us, I know I'm guilty of this, where the step changes, but you don't change the words, but you know what it means.
Right.
So you're doing it that way, and maybe your team knows that too, but when a new team member comes in, they're going to be like, what? Why does it say that when we do this, right? And so, or it's like, I do this step, but now there's a next step, and I know that I need to do that step next. And rather than adding it to the checklist, I just use my mental RAM to remember to do that. But then the new person comes in and they're not going to know to do that, right? And so that's why it's important to update it. And so, yeah, even if it's like monthly or quarterly or some sort of regularly occurring time period, what we just had is we just started doing is each of our team members keeps sort of a running tab of what they do, what they're responsible for, and how they do it. And we have a task that renews every month that they need to go in and make sure it's currently up to date with what they do.
Right.
That's how we do that. Another thing, like you said, rolling out a new system. We're about to roll out a new billing system. I was on that call just before I came to this webinar, and that's kind of scary because, to your point, we're going to be running two systems at once while we learn the new system, and then we have to make sure that our workflow captures the in between, but then also adapts to the new system. And so we were talking with the developers about, we absolutely need to know this part from the new system right away so that we can make sure we're paying our people, right? And so then we might have to run it twice for a couple weeks until everything's up and running in the new system. But also just making sure that we update the workflow to include the new system, right? So that's why we're saying when you adopt a new tool, for us, it's a whole new time tracking and billing software. That's really going to change how we handle payroll, how we handle client management. So we want to make sure we update our workflows to incorporate that.
Right.
And the last part about this is what I like to call white space. And that's really just time to think. In that Upstream article that I referenced earlier, he calls it slack. And what he was saying is we're part of the reason departments exist is because we want people to be able to focus. And that's how they're able to be efficient, right? So if I'm only focused on HR, or I'm only focused on marketing, or I'm only focused on operations or whatever, then you're more efficient. But the problem with that is they said it leads to tunneling, where that's all you're focused on. So you don't really have time to stop and say, hey, that baton keeps getting dropped. How do we prevent that, right? And so you want to make sure you're giving your team what I call white space, what he calls slack, but it's just time to stop and think and have a meeting and say, hey, this problem keeps happening. What can we do about it? And so like us at Freedom Makers, we have a quarterly meeting where we talk about, hey, what's been going well? What do we think could we do better? And then we come up with basically a project plan for what we want to accomplish in the next quarter based on those things that we think are priorities for us to improve.
Yeah. And I think, that really goes back to that whole conversation about trust and communication, and allowing your team to have that voice. And it's interesting because just today I have a daily team meeting, and I had my team meeting with today, and one of the team was talking about an expectation that I had that had to do with how they're tracking their time. But we ended up having this long conversation about how they can track their time more efficiently and what that workflow would be, so that I have a better idea of, are they working on client work, or are they working on company work, or is it, admin time? But having that space in that meeting and having that trust within the group of being able to say, hey, I know this is what you expect of me, but I don't know that I can do this under these certain circumstances, and giving that flexibility to say, okay, well, let's talk about how we can improve that process. And we came out of it with some great ideas, and that I was able to change those triggers within 5 minutes in QuickBooks. Mm-hmm. So it's important to like I said, this is not set in stone. You have to be flexible, and you have to keep moving and massaging the process until it's really good. And then keep looking at it, because new tools and new toys and new technology will come out. But it's never a one and done. Life is changing far too quickly.
I do want to bring that back around to when we talked about earlier, like sometimes you don't need a big fancy tool. Sometimes it's simply adding a checkbox, right? At the same time, I don't want to minimize. Sometimes it is a big thing, right? For us, changing our time tracking and billing is a big change for us, right? And it was important and it was necessary. And so I'm totally fine with it. But um, what I'm trying to say though is like, if it's overwhelming, like, oh, I need to create a whole new workflow for all these little things, start small. Start
Right.
on one section. Start with just that check mark and work your way through it. It doesn't have to be all changed at once, all perfect either. Unless, of course, you're doing your billing and subscription system, then you need to change it all at once. Or time
but
tracking
it's
billing,
but it's been a long process. I mean, this has been
yeah.
something that I know you've been working on over time, and so it's also important that same white space goes with when you're making a huge shift like that. Don't expect to have that checklist or that SOP or whatever within, a day or within a couple hours. You have to look at the magnitude or the what's the opposite of magnitude, but the whatever the small, however small or however large that is, and be realistic about the time it's going to take to create that and give yourself the space to do that, because otherwise you're either not going to have all the information, or it's going to be kind of a half-assed thing, and you're still going to be stumbling over it and using that mental RAM to get the process done.
Exactly. All right. So then with that though, especially I feel like no one talked about contingency plans until COVID
So
happened.
yeah.
Now it's like all on our minds.
Yes.
So I'll start this by saying, I guess I'll start from the bottom up around business continuity. So for me, I remember hearing in the past about, businesses should have emergency disaster plans. They should know how to react when, say, or tornado hits or hurricane and just knocks out your office with all your files in it. What are you going to do, kind of thing. And I always thought, that doesn't apply to me. I'm completely remote. If a hurricane hits, no biggie. I mean, of course, not taking away from the devastation of a hurricane, but just saying like, it's not going to impact necessarily our company documents or whatnot, because we run everything online, right? Um, Now that I've been saying that for like 5 years now. I'm like, unless we lose electricity, and we can't get online. But anyway, I'll have to rethink that. But then I realized with COVID is that it was more the impact. Or I used to always joke that if our business would be impacted if Google went down. And if Google went down, the whole world is ending. So I don't need a contingency plan. But then with COVID, I realized the contingency plan is more, it's not just about your physical assets, it's about your human capital as well. And so in our case, it was like, if something happens to me, what happens to the business, right? And so because of that, we started building out our continuity plan, which really just shares with my team, where are our files? What is our insurance policy? How do you access our bank accounts? Who should you call if I win the lottery and go buy an island without telling anyone, right? Like, that's the positive way to put it, right? And so we captured all that, and we also put in a trigger to check it. I think we put it once a month or once a quarter. I can't remember when it was, but to make sure we're keeping it updated with any new people that we start interacting with, or if we change our insurance policy or anything like that. So so that's important. Like, don't think just about physical assets, but also about human capital, which kind of goes back into that backup rules as well. For us, we're a team of 4, right? You're the same size, right? And so it's like, how can you have a backup when you only have 4 people? But really, it's more like, okay, if Erin's out sick, Wilma's able to fill in for her. Wilma can't do it exactly like Erin does it, because Wilma doesn't do her job every day. But we have enough steps in there that she could figure it out to get by, right? Until either Erin came back, or if it was a long-term departure, until Wilma has made it her own, right? And so we have that where for every single function, every single lane of responsibility, someone else is able to step in and fill in for that when and if necessary.
Right, and having those workflows, I'm preparing for that. We don't have as much of that on a day-to-day basis, but I'm preparing for that because one of my team will be going out on leave towards the end of the year, and I'm really pushing. It's like we need to have everything documented so that if she has to go out early or if anything happens, we are able to say, okay, we can still keep moving forward, and we have all the information we need. So it's really important that we can use these as that backup plan and make sure that we all know what the information is and where that information is, so we can keep the business moving forward. And then our middle one in there is that pandemic, which is really any kind of unexpected, unexplained shift in the world that kind of, today I read something that says we have lived a decade in the last 6 months. You just don't see it coming. It totally comes out of left field. And you really have to be nimble to be able to shift. And, having workflows in place, even if you're going to have to change those, at least you have it documented so you can see what needs to be changed. And you can easily pivot your business. And, and I think you can see that a lot with people who were able to move from in-person to online, or without it creating too much havoc, or they had those workflows in place so that they could take whatever was in person and figure out how to make that online, or whatever type of shift you have to make. And so it just gives you a little more comfort in knowing that whatever life throws at you, you can stand up to it and be able to continue on.
It goes back to that mental RAM. If you have your workflows up here, then when you have to pivot, you don't have any space to figure that out. And so if all that is outside, now you have the space to be like, oh, okay, I need to go this way or go that way. And you have the gig space to install a new program. Yes. I need to stop my analogies, but
well, and at the same time, the pandemic, this has caused so much stress and anxiety in itself. And if you're dealing with that stress and anxiety and your own mental wellness, not to mention if you actually got sick, but your own mental wellness around this, and you're trying to keep those workflows going in your head, you have nothing left. And so it's just for your own mental health, please get it documented. Please put it down on something that you can go back and check those boxes or follow those steps, because you just don't know, and you need to be able to take care of yourself mentally in these weird times, because right now it's a pandemic, and we were joking that we still don't know where the killer hornets hornets are. Like they're still somewhere out there in the world, and we don't know where those are and what's going on. But it's, we really need to be able to take care of ourselves mentally, and having these things documented will take that little bit out of having to remember and having to manage in our heads.
All right, we've got 6 minutes left, so I want to make sure we go through.
Our case studies. So, real quickly, the employee action request, or the status change form, is something that I've used since I started in HR. And it's a simple form that says, okay, this person is being hired or terminated, or there's a change in pay or a change in position. And when I started consulting, I recreated this form. And honestly, it was a paper form. It was a Word doc that I would send out to clients. And I think in terms of, growing that workflow, being able to go from, that simple Word doc, and it would come in and I'd be able to process it. I'd have documentation on it. And it evolved into a DocuSign document that had all kinds of fancy contingent different fields on it, and we're moving it now into a JOT form. But we've also built on it. So as we've gone along, there's been questions about, well, if somebody's taking a leave of absence, and so we added a section in. And again, it's taking that time to review the document and say, okay, now we have more people who are taking leaves. What kind of questions do we need to ask? And having that all in one place, so that when that information is shared with us, we have that trigger to follow those steps. And so with a new hire, we know we need to follow whatever the new hire is, getting an offer letter out, getting the new hire forms out, scheduling the I-9, making sure their benefits are in place. all of that is answered by completing this employment action request. And whatever section is filled out, we know that we have the process, we have the workflow behind it to be able to manage that for our clients. And as we continue to grow and new things come up, we'll probably add more check boxes to it that is like, here's a question that we need to be able to answer, and we need to have it at the time that they send this information in, and we don't want to have to go scrambling for it later. So again, it's just a simple case study for us of something that has definitely evolved over time and continues to evolve, both in terms of the content of it and in terms of the technology that we're using to manage that and make sure that we have, that we get that. And like I said, it went from a paper document to now it's in Jot form with Zapier, and it goes into our email, and it has all kinds of automatic things that happen. And then that triggers off our Asana checklist. So
great. Okay, I'll keep mine really short because I want to make sure we finish in time. But anytime you guys want to hear the whole story, feel free to reach out to me. I'll share it with you. But when I worked for a corporation, I basically built out a whole new workflow for recruiting pilots. We were hiring about 30 people a week once I got us up and running. And not all pilots, but the pilots were a critical piece of it. We were an airline. And but one of the things that happened was, because of where we flew, our pilots needed to have a clearance, and they were joining us before they got their clearance. And then once they joined us, and if they couldn't get their clearance, then, and this was with mechanics too, the chief pilots and the maintenance managers were coming up to us saying, is there something we can have them do while we wait for them to get that clearance? And we're like, what? We're headquarters. We have like 2 aircraft. What can we have them do while they're here? And so basically what I did is I moved that so that where they had to have that before we gave them a hire date or start date. And so that was, that really, really helped us meet our recruiting numbers. So I'll leave it there, and then we'll go into our offers, and hopefully you don't mind sticking around for some questions.
Yep, and as always, we have our pandemic policy package. Just a reminder that as people are going back to work, you need to have your FFCRA policies in place. And the regular price on this is $149, and it's going back to $149 as of July 1st. So if you don't have your policy package set up yet, please feel free to reach out to us at go.eoshr.com/COVID.
And what we've been offering is a battle rhythm review, and it's basically what we went over today. If you want us to look at what your specific workflows are and help you identify ways to resolve the triggers, reach out to us, schedule it here, and we can spend some time with you to help you review that and give you some ideas.
And our next Remote Strong webinar will be July 9th, and that's on powering up your remote team with effective meetings.
And here's an example of how we have a missed trigger or misplaced tool, if you will. I know we added a slide with our contact information in it, yet I continue to go back to our previous deck when I build out what we outline. And so we don't have that slide in here. And so we need to make sure we put the template in a spot, and that you guys hold me accountable to make sure I use the template when I put our outline.
When you build our slides. All right.
Okay, ladies. Just one question that came up from somebody, and it kind of, I had to actually look it up during the webinar because it's really interesting. And Jake asked, are lanes of responsibility similar to using RACI matrix? RACI? I'm not sure how that's said. Are you guys familiar with that?
I'm familiar with it. I'm not well enough to say specifically. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I've looked at that.
Yeah, I don't know what that is, but really what lanes of responsibility are, I mean, you know, you can get technical with it, but it's really, do people know what they're supposed to be doing? And who's supposed to be doing what is really what, you know, basically what it boils down to. And if that's not clear, then you have the crossovers.
So the acronym is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed.
Yeah, so it identifies the key roles and responsibilities against a major task within a project. It's sort of like that. It's I think that's kind of drilling it down into a project. I think we're talking expanding that beyond just a project into your whole work, your business flow. So it would kind of taking the RACI and expanding that over your entire company processes.
When we're talking about lanes of responsibility.
Yeah, yeah.
And but you could certainly use that within your workflows.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think they are pretty similar. It's interesting. Now I'm kind of fascinated by that. So Jake, thanks for bringing that up. Okay, ladies, we are at our time. I want to thank everybody for joining us. It's great to see you every 2 weeks, or kind of see your name, and new names pop up. So we look forward to having you on July 9th. So have a happy 4th of July, everybody.
Thank you.